Excellent. Well, thank you so much for the kind introduction, the opportunity to speak here today. Following Chris, that's quite some good leadership lessons to impart. So thanks for that, Chris. So we're going to talk about this trauma system thing. Not unlike Chris, wish I had something to disclose, but I just don't. And so what we're going to talk about is where this trauma system of things started. And what I would draw your attention to is the red star. Every one of the slides that has a red star on it was created in the era. So dating back to 98 through about 2010, you'll find that those slides are all originals that were given in presentations either to convince someone of something that we needed to do, or to lay out the future, or to tell part of the story of what we had done. And so as we entered into the era of my residency, there was a change afoot. And there was a push to create smaller teams, smaller go-to-war teams, which meant smaller medical teams. And they had to be able to deploy those teams at a more forward location. And so this was that concept, is that the only way to get to a surgeon was at a combat support hospital in the classic era. And so the creation of forward surgical teams, and each of the services created their own version of this, would allow a smaller team to get closer to the time of wounding, closer to the injured combatant. And so the mission of that team would be to do damage control surgery, save lives, stop bleeding, stop contamination, and then get that patient on to the next level. It was interesting that we wrote about this concept, and the current editor-in-chief of the Journal of Trauma and his partner, Admiral Eisman, wrote an editorial saying that the military had lost their mind, that there was no way you could do damage control surgery in the battlefield. They've yet to print a retraction on that, but I do point it out to Gene every once in a while. So this is one of those original teams, John Pilcher, Ken Kaler here. I don't know who everyone else is, but this is what that five-person Air Force surgical team looked like. And it was a man-portable, meaning you could carry it, you could put it in a Humvee, you could get it there yourself. You didn't need a forklift or a big aircraft to get your stuff there. The Army's version of that was this able to provide life-saving surgery for 40 patients in the first 48 hours, and had an ICU capability that was built into it, with 3 general surgeons, 1 orthopedic surgeon, which probably everybody has to do some orthopedics if you're going out there, and then this group of folks that are really going to provide the crux of the care, and the enlisted folks. Surgeon Mark Taylor was killed the day before redeploying in Fallujah by a rocket attack, serving in an FST. The other thing that didn't exist was this concept of moving a really sick patient across the continuum of care. We didn't have portable ventilators, we didn't have flying ICUs, et cetera. And so that had to be invented. So they came up with this concept of critical care air transport team. Again, this is all circa 95, 96, 97 time frame. And it's kind of like taking your patient and getting on the elevator for a few hours. Just hang out in the elevator, take with you what you need to provide the care for the next several hours, and then you can get off the elevator and go to the hospital again. So pretty heady thing. I was probably the 7th CCAT surgeon, I think, as I recall, coming out of fellowship. Today I couldn't do it. They'd make me go to CCAT school. I just couldn't just come out of fellowship and be a CCAT doctor anymore. So these guys have short-circuited the time from wounding to arrival back in the continental United States from 21 days in the Vietnam era to 3 days within the current system of care. There have been over 50,000 CCAT flights to date, and very little mortality in the air with those groups. Part of this concept is not only does the surgical capability get less the closer you are to the wounded patient, but the time distance between point A and point B can be very prolonged. And hence today, the push for the prolonged field care, if you don't have air superiority, that will write a new chapter in this book of military trauma systems. The real goal of the system, you can have the American College of Surgeons version of it, or you can just use my simple surgeon view of it, is get the right patient to the right hospital in the right amount of time. And if you add one more aspect to that, give them the right care, then you've got the formula. So back in 2004, we had been in Afghanistan for 3 years already, and in Iraq for 9 months. And the team of folks left San Antonio to go to take over Steve Hetz's 31st Combat Support Hospital. You saw the award dedicated in Steve's honor. And John Holcomb was the Surgeon General's consultant following Steve's tenure in that role. And I got a call in November of 2004 during the second taking of Fallujah, Operation Phantom Fury. And we did, in 3 operating rooms, we did 70 major trauma operations the first day of that. We did 450 over the 10 days in those operating rooms. About day 3 of this, I get a call from Holcomb who says, "Hey, would you get down to Baghdad and work for the Army Command and set up a trauma system?" I'm like, "No. I'm knee-deep in Marines. What, are you kidding me? I can't leave here now." And so about a week later, I get a call. This time it's from the Surgeon General, who says, "Hey, we've been keeping tabs on things, and it seems like you're not taking care of any Marines anymore, so would you go now?" I'm like, "Okay, I'll do it." So headed south and to work with the 44th Medical Command. We had the support of the American College of Surgeons to use their systems book. And the problem was this, was that what do you do with an injured Marine? You take him to a Navy hospital, because that's what we do with injured Marines. It doesn't matter that the Marine has a brain injury and needs a neurosurgeon, and the Navy doesn't have a neurosurgeon at that hospital. The Army has a neurosurgeon equidistant in the opposite direction, but we don't take injured Marines to Army hospitals. That's just not how we roll. And so for lack of a system, we had avoidable risk and under triage and unnecessary loss of life. As the invading forces moved in, they all took their small medical teams with them, and nobody ever coalesced that stuff. And so you've got all of this little tiny bits of care in an unorganized fashion that was not helping to save lives. So we looked at the base order of the war and saw that there was no call for a trauma system. We needed to develop one. And because we had fallen behind the experience that we had gathered in the civilian construct. So the Army Surgeon General sent me a team of all volunteer nurses. God bless them, they are all volunteers. There was one actual trauma nurse there. There were a couple of pediatric clinic nurses. One was the nurse historian of the reserve. And they didn't know a lot about trauma care or performance improvement or practice guidelines or trauma databases or any of that stuff. So we taught them how to do it. And the way we did that was we helped out across town in Baghdad at the Army Hospital at Ibn Sina, where a couple of guys by names of Spinella and Graithwall and company were putting together. They were collecting some data on whole blood utilization. So we were going through these charts, collecting this information, and the nurses learned where documentation was missing, what was missing, and what the problems were. And they developed history and physical examination forms, and et cetera, et cetera. The work that they did and put in those Excel spreadsheets ended up being the seminal one-to-one-to-one transfusion paper. And so this is what we did. We created practice guidelines. We made sure that records were transmitted with the patients, because up until then, the best record you could have was what was written on the patient's bandages. So when they arrived in Launchstool, there would be a drawing on the dressing of the leg demonstrating what the fracture pattern was underneath, or a drawing on the abdominal dressing that would say 2 lap pads near the liver placed on this date at this time. Was the best information you could get about those patients in that era. And so we needed to take the playbook from the American College of Surgeons, put it in place in the combat zone. And so we came up with this plan and convinced the commanding general that this was the thing that we needed to do, was to organize ourselves better, write these guidelines, track this data, and then report back on how we were doing. And it started out with a casualty evacuation form, simple as that. No record of the care of the injuries or the care rendered in the field was present. I'm not the one that chose that drawing. That's the fittest trauma patient I've ever seen in my life. But my trauma nurses liked that form, and that's the form we went with. Key data bits, pretty easy, check the box kind of a thing. We adopted triage and transfer guidelines so that no longer would we take all 90 patients from a single explosion to a small Navy hospital. We would distribute those casualties across multiple hospitals and get the injured that need a neurosurgeon to a neurosurgeon straight away. We created a H&P form because the history and physical examination form was a blank piece of paper. And when you give a surgeon a blank piece of paper in a combat zone, you get what you asked for, which is drawings on a bandage. So we also didn't have a good communication scheme. The way that you knew the casualties were arriving was like Radar O'Reilly from MASH, is when you heard the helicopter rotors overhead. And you didn't know if it was going to be a single casualty or 22 casualties in 2 Chinooks arriving simultaneously to you, or what their injuries were, which was preposterous. It was a terrible thing. And so we had to fix that. We also didn't know the capability of our hospitals. So we took a page out of our playbook in San Antonio where we know every unit of every type of blood in every hospital at a moment's notice, and adopted that, in a simple Excel spreadsheet that we could use for our own purposes. Because if you don't want to overwhelm a facility that's already overwhelmed, if you have another facility that's 20 minutes further away but has more current capability. And part of the problem was this, is that when the casualty gets injured, there would be communication, and the casualty would be moved to a collection point where a helicopter could then fly to go and fetch them. And there's all kinds of communication happening here. The thing that wasn't happening was no one was notifying the hospital. So now we notified the hospital, say, hey, casualty coming to you, or casualties, and these are their injuries. And it was a pretty easy, straightforward thing. We already had all the comms in place. We just didn't have the plan to be able to do that. And because of the immediacy of the timing of death in these combat casualties, as Ron Bellamy showed us from the Vietnam era, we needed to move pretty smartly along. And so at that time, we decided that 2 hours from injury to surgery was probably the goal that we wanted to achieve. And we used that trauma model from South Texas and imprinted it on Iraq that General Granger dubbed the Del Rio model of trauma care, because you are 4 hours from definitive care in San Antonio from Del Rio, Texas, where there's an air base and airmen, getting motorcycle crashes and such like that. So if we accept 4 hours on a daily basis for our own troops back home, 2 hours in the combat theater would probably be a fair goal to arrange. And the idea was over triage, get the casualties to the definitive care as quickly as possible. That way, with a trauma system in place, you should be able to save more patients' lives by getting the right care to the right patient at the right place in the right amount of time. Circa 2006, the Joint Patient Tracking Application, which actually wasn't bad for a medical record tool to be able to transmit information across the oceans to let people know what was happening. And then we started up these video and teleconferences where we would talk about last week's injured combatants every Thursday morning, San Antonio time, Thursday afternoon, combat zone time. And talk about the casualties and talk about the care that they received in Germany, then by CCAT teams, and then back at Walter Reed or San Antonio, or even at the VA. And problems encountered, so that we could learn those lessons and pass them on. Because I'll tell you that if you do the same thing repeatedly and you're doing it the wrong way and nobody ever tells you, you won't have a reason to change. And those are some of the problems that we had, is that we weren't providing the feedback that folks needed. The components then of that system begin with prevention. So we got involved in a number of things, and we'll talk about one or two of those, all the way through having a registry to be able to track this data and look at it. So we had shunts. We had no practical use of shunts in the combat zone until the war started. And it was very successful in terms of the number of vascular shunts and the number of limbs that remained viable in a nice paper that Rasmussen and company put together for us. That's what that shunt looks like in situ. Very high success rate. We also were not using wound vacuum devices. We had them. They were being used on Iraqi patients to bridge until they could get a skin graft, but there was no portable version that could go in an aircraft. And in fact, the very first version of this, when they took it for air safety training, or air safety and airworthiness, when they fired up the wound vac, the chafe and flares in the C-17 went off. I got no idea what signal is in a damn wound vac that would make that happen, but you know, if you ever have a wound vac explosion, there might be something to that. I don't know. But we weren't using them in our own soldiers, but we were using them just to do dressing change until skin grafting in Iraqi patients. And so it was Mark Richardson, a classmate of mine, orthopedic surgeon, who said, "Hey, Jenkins, why aren't we closing these wounds? This is crazy. You should be closing these. You definitely can do it. They're clean enough." And I'm like, "Didn't you ever, dude? We went to the same medical school. You know, America's medical school, and it's in the book. It says you don't do that." And he's like, "No, I think we can." I'm like, "Okay, I'll let you try it once, maybe twice, and we'll see. We'll see what happens." And so after a couple of washouts, we were closing these wounds, closing them over drains, and in fact, they healed up perfectly well. Far lesser stay in the hospital. Down from a historical stay of about 30 days down to about a week, 2.5 operations per patient, and no infections. Game changer, caused the company, KCI, to create the portable version of it so that we could put that in the aircraft. Burn management, we were killing soldiers by over-resuscitating them who were burned and being transported across 2 oceans because no medical record gets directly transmitted with the patient. The medical record belongs to the unit. It does not belong to the patient. And so no one knew how much fluid these people were getting. So it was Alan Murdoch who back home at ISR in San Antonio, 6 soldiers in the same month developed abdominal compartment syndrome and died as a result of their over-resuscitation. We created a piece of paper and sent the piece of paper with the patient. The only form that I know of to this day that still gets transmitted with the patient through the continuum of care. We were asked about whether or not Nomex flight suits should be issued to Marines on patrol because they sensed that they were getting burned, and we looked into the data. And the data supported that. In fact, it was far more soldiers getting burned, and the burn size had trended up tremendously, as did the mortality. And so we bought $25 million worth of Nomex uniforms and put them on Marines and soldiers on patrols. Today, it's embedded in the uniform itself, thanks to the hard work at the ISR. The guy who asked the question, spent the money to do that, saw these results as we embarked on that project. The burn size went down, as did mortality. Was killed when his helicopter was shot out of the sky over Baghdad. Colonel Brian Allgood. Whole blood, we talked about this for a minute. This is the original study comparing fresh whole blood to component therapy. Higher mortality despite lower injury severity in the component group changed our lives forever in terms of one-to-one resuscitation and the advent of whole blood in our civilian trauma systems. This is the way I was taught to resuscitate patients. This is what saves lives. And so we changed our way of doing things based upon good data from the trauma registry. We also employed thromboelastography. I'm sure if you talk to Dan Bonneville, he can tell you a sad story about that from his time in Iraq, or maybe SP, Josh, the OR 13 days or whatever that was. But we put thromboelastography into the war. As it turned out, General Granger was a hematologist, loved the idea, and put a thromboelastogram device in every one of the combat support hospitals across Iraq that were under his control. We've seen the case fatality rate drop tremendously over that previous conflicts, and I dedicate this talk to my friend John Pryor, who lost his life in a rocket attack up in Mosul on Christmas Day 2008. So thank you very much for the time and your attention, the opportunity to present you this historical discussion related to trauma systems. Thank you very much.